ask you one question about the Supreme Court here and one question about the Supreme Court in Israel.
Oh, good.
And you can answer both. The first, and of course you clerked on the Supreme Court, concerns the recent disclosures about Justice Clarence Thomas, and whether you think a sort of crisis is building at the court around this question of whether there should be an ethical code, and questions about just the role of the court generally, and its, let's say, legitimacy. My question about Israel is...
why don't we do one at a time?
Okay,
let me do this first. You know, I'm 84 years old, 2 questions. Hard to keep both in mind. There should be a code of ethics binding on Supreme Court justices. Supreme Court justices should not be exempt from that. There is an argument made by some people that it would violate the separation of powers to have Congress impose a code of ethics. That's nonsense. Congress decides how many justices there are. The Constitution doesn't say how many justices. You can have 1, you can have 3, you can have 15. So Congress has a lot of authority. Congress decides how many votes you need to get review in the Supreme Court. Congress decides on the jurisdiction of the Supreme Court. Why can't it impose ethical rules on the Supreme Court? It should, and the ethical rules should include what Clarence Thomas did, taking expensive vacations for people who may not directly have an impact on the court, but among the people who came to these events was Leonard Leo, who was the kingmaker in Washington. He's the guy who picks justices. And the public has the right to know about these things. So I think there ought to be a code of ethics.
Great. And my question, in Israel, many of us are familiar with upheaval that's happened there in recent months around judicial reform. My question is, well, 2 mini parts. One is, would you be marching in the streets with the protesters against the government's judicial reform plan? And 2, do you think Israel should have a constitution, and would you want to be part of writing it?
They're both very difficult questions. When this first started, let me give you a little background. My 2 oldest friends in Israel are Aharon Barak, who I met in 1966 when he came to Harvard to be a teaching fellow at Harvard. I was a young assistant professor, and he was a young assistant professor at Hebrew University. He, of course, is the author of the revolution, the judicial revolution in Israel. He became the president of the Supreme Court. So he's my oldest Israeli friend. My second oldest Israeli friend is a young man I met in 1970 when he was a student at MIT, named Ben Natai. Became Benjamin Netanyahu. His name at the time was Ben Natai. And we became good friends. And so I think it's fair to say, Carolyn, that in all the times we've gone to Israel, we have always had dinner with both the Baraks and the Netanyahus. And I consider them both friends. They both trust me. And therefore, I am very torn by this. I think the Supreme Court of Israel is the most powerful Supreme Court, not only in the world, but in the history of the world. There has never been a more powerful Supreme Court. There is no requirement for standing. Anybody can bring a lawsuit. Any NGO, it doesn't have to even be an Israeli NGO, can bring a lawsuit challenging the law in Israel. It's unheard of in the United States. They have no political question doctrine as we do in the United States. The Supreme Court of Israel decides on the constitutionality, the legality without a constitution, the legality of the gas deal in Lebanon, the legality of whether Aryeh Deri can serve in the government. And so the Supreme Court is the most powerful court in the world. If all the judicial reforms that have been proposed, and many of them are terrible, but if all of them were enacted, the Israel Supreme Court would be like the American Supreme Court, like the British court, like the German Constitutional Court, like the French, Italian, New Zealand, and Australian court. It would not end democracy in Israel. Both sides have incredibly overstated the stakes in this judicial reform. That's number one. Number 2, it is none of Europe's effing business what goes on in Israel in judicial reform. Why are they involved? Why is the European Union taking positions on this? Did the European Union take a position when Democrats in the United States wanted to pack the court after Roe versus Wade was overruled? No. Has there ever in the history of the world been protests over judicial reform? Never. Only in Israel. And only in Israel Does the world come down? Jewish leaders in America, congresswomen, congressmen,
Moody's.
all objecting, huh?
Moody's.
Moody, yeah, well, that was the fault.
Rating agents.
That's Bloomberg's fault. Let's put responsibility where it is. Bloomberg's a nice guy. I like him, I know him. He has no idea what he's talking about when it comes to judicial reform. But he said that if judicial reform is enacted, the bond rating and value of Israel will go down. That's what's called a self-fulfilling prophecy. There is no relationship between judicial reform and the economic strength of Israel. None, except for self-fulfilling prophecies. And so what's happened is, so to answer your question, I would not today participate in a march against the reform. I said when I was in Israel, Carol and I were in Israel for 5 weeks in December around this year, and I said at that point I would join the demonstrations when the demonstrations were moderate and reasonable. Today, they are anti-Zionist, often anti-Israel, and they're hurting Israel tremendously, economically. They're hurting them with ignorant members of Congress, Jewish ignorant members of Congress, and there are plenty of those. And of course, as usual, Shomer Yisrael, Chuck Schumer, is on both sides of every issue. So I don't support the judicial reform. I think they're bad. I think there are compromises. What I would like to see is, the ability of the Knesset to override Supreme Court decisions that are political, economic, and that have nothing to do with human rights, civil liberties, minority rights, and basic fundamental liberties, but not override on the basis of anything that has to do with civil liberties and human rights. And I spoke to Bibi about that, and he seemed sympathetic to that view. As far as the appointment of justices, I would eliminate the veto that the 3 justices serving on the commission currently have, but I would maintain a majority of professionals on the committee and a minority of political people. And there's room for compromise, and I can't get into the details here in public, but I have been in constant touch with the president of Israel, who's also an old friend, not really as old a friend as the other 2, but Bougie Herzog is a wonderful, wonderful man. And I am working closely with him on some possible advice, and but I can't get into any details about it. Let me put it this way: I have offered my advice. I have offered what I can as a mediator, as a facilitator, because I'm friendly with both sides, and both sides, I think, trust me. But right now, the likelihood of compromise is very slight. Why? Because both sides are winning. How can both sides be winning? Both sides are winning because the left was dead in the water in the last election, and these protests, which have come from the heart and soul of Israel. By the way, Israel has taught the world how to conduct protests, and they ought to be praised for it. These are protests that are being conducted in the spirit of Martin Luther King and Mahatma Gandhi. There's no violence, there's no threats. The protests have been, and nobody in the government has tried to stop them. Benjamin Netanyahu urged the protesters to be well-behaved and responsible, but he didn't ask them to stop protesting. These have been, when you compare these protests to other protests in the world, whether it be the Arab Spring, whether it be Black Lives Matter, I'm obviously not going to insult anybody by comparing them to Iran, where they execute protesters, but the Israeli protests have been a model of democracy and how protests should work, and they worked. They got the slowdown of the process, not an end, and maybe in the end there'll be violence, and maybe in the end there won't be compromises. But this is purely an internal Israeli affair, and it is not something that the American Jewish community should be involved in. It's not something that the European community should be involved in. I'm involved in it only as a volunteer, and I wouldn't dream of telling Israel what to do. I will, if I ask, give advice, as I have on many other issues. But again, I think both sides have overstated the stakes. Israel will remain a vibrant democracy no matter what. And the best proof of that is 2 things. Number one, all these protests, that's the sign of a real democracy. You don't have those in Poland, and you don't have those in Hungary. Second, 5 elections in 4 years. What could be more democratic than that?
A little less democracy would be okay.
Okay, so we've got a lot of questions from the audience.
Good.
Great questions. I want to try and get through as many as possible. So I'll start with this one.
Yeah.
At one time, you were considered a radical liberal.
Never.
Now you're seen as a right-wing radical. Have you changed, or has the world changed?
I haven't changed at all. I was never a left-wing radical. I was always a libertarian, liberal, civil libertarian. I never believed in the extremes. I always rejected the hard left, as I still reject the right. I am a liberal Democrat, and I've never changed my views. I don't think I will ever change my views. I'm not a Republican. I would never vote for, I think I voted for one Republican. Bill Weld was our neighbor in Massachusetts. He ran for governor, and my wife and I split on that. You voted for John Silver, and I voted for Bill Weld. I think he's the only Republican I ever voted for. And I believe in the Democratic platform. I believe in a woman's right to choose. I believe in gay rights. I believe in climate control, gun control. People ask me all the time. Trump has asked me, how can you vote Democrat? I said, because I support the Democratic platform. I don't support the Republican platform. I said, you want me to vote Republican? Very simple. Become like the British Conservative Party. And then if I were living in Britain today, I would join the British Conservative Party. British Conservative Party is opposed to the death penalty, in favor of gay rights, in favor of choice, in favor of climate control, in favor of gun control. They just have a slightly tougher foreign policy, and perhaps
You'd be buying low on the Tories these days.
Say that again?
You'd be buying low on the Tories.
On the what?
On the Tories.
On
the conservatives.
But you know.
They could do with some help.
And of course, I could never support the Labor Party when it was under the control of a virulent anti-Semite. Just like I could never vote for Bernie Sanders. I wouldn't vote for Trump, but I would not vote for Bernie Sanders. I would vote Libertarian or something else. I couldn't vote for a man, Bernie Sanders, who went to England and actively campaigned for, what's his name? Corbyn. Actively campaigned for an openly anti-Semitic and anti-Israeli candidate. So I could never, ever support that. No, Bobby Kennedy's a friend of mine. We've debated, we've had social time together. He's not qualified to be president.
So it sounds like you're saying the world has changed in terms of the perception of your position.
Changing, but you know, I can't judge the world. All I can tell you is I haven't changed. I have look, you can call me an old fuddy-dud and all of that, but I have not changed my views since college. I can't think of a single issue, major issue, in which I have a different view today than I had when I was even in my junior years in high school and college. So no, I haven't changed my views, and I'm not a Republican. I'm not a radical right. Nothing of the sort. Yeah.
This one looks like it was written by your agent. Have your cancellation problems affected the coverage or distribution of your books?
Well, my agent is here. It's Karen. Where are you? Yeah, great agent, Karen Gantz. Yes, without a doubt.
Maybe an agent of your agent.
I'll give you an example. I'm writing a very serious book. I've written 52 books, and about 20 of them have been very serious books about. You know, I have a book about the Fifth Amendment. I have a book about the origin of rights. I have lots of serious books, and then for the last few years, I've written a lot of political books. But now, I'm trying to write a book that kind of summarizes my academic work. It's called The Preventive State, how governments are moving toward trying to prevent cataclysmic events without giving the government too much power. It's a very serious book. And 10 years ago, every publisher would have been clamoring for it. But today, they're not clamoring for it. I have a great publisher, but he's not an academic publisher. And my agent has sent my book to a dozen academic presses that would normally be jumping for joy over a serious academic book by a popular figure who gets on television and sells books. After all, I had the #1 New York Times bestseller. How many people have had #1 New York Times bestseller? I've had 7 other New York Times bestsellers, and academic presses won't go near me because of the cancellation.
Why does the American Bar Association not defend the Constitution?
Nobody defends the Constitution anymore. Harvey Silverglade and I do. There are a few others, but not very, very many. It's the Constitution for me, but not for thee. The American Bar Association doesn't defend lawyers. They only defend lawyers that they are willing to identify with. The fate of civil liberties and constitutionalism in America it's in terrible, terrible shape. And I'm going to continue to defend the Constitution, and I'll continue to be unpopular for doing so. I used to teach a class on freedom of speech, and I would start by saying, how many of you support freedom of speech? Every hand goes up. How many of you would make an exception for Holocaust denial? Hands go up. How many of you would make an exception for racist hate speech? Hands go up. How many of you would make an exception for sexism? Hands go up. By the end of the class, every hand had gone up for an exception, and there was nothing left of the First Amendment. And so very few people actually support freedom of speech. They support freedom of speech for me, not for thee. How many people support due process? How many people would actually want to see due process applied to hateful people? Not very many. Look what's going on with the ACLU. It's dead in the water. It hasn't said anything about what's going on college campuses today, where censorship is rampant. My nephew was here. How many years ago was it, Adam, when I had to defend you? Adam was a wise guy in college at MIT, and in order to protest their policies on pornography, he showed the film Deep Throat, a pretty awful film, and he got busted. And he and I and a number of other professors stood up and we won our case. And today that wouldn't happen in colleges. Today you'd be canceled, I'd be canceled. Let me tell you how extreme it is. I taught for 50 years at Harvard. I was one of the most popular teachers at Harvard. To this day, people come over to me and say, how come you didn't let me into your class? Including Barack Obama said that when he invited me to the White House one day. He said, why am I inviting you here? You didn't let me into my class. It wasn't me, it was a computer. But in any event, I was a very, very popular teacher. I do not think I could be invited today to give a lecture at Harvard Law School that would not be disrupted. I don't think they would allow me to finish and complete a speech on freedom of speech, on a woman's right to choose, on any issue. On Israel, forget about it. By the way, you know who invented the concept of Trump derangement syndrome? Me. Not in the context of Trump. 20 years before Trump ever ran for president, I invented a term called Israel derangement syndrome. And I wrote about it. And I said, you can have rational discussions with people like Noam Chomsky and people like Peter Beinart. You can have rational discussions with them about a million subjects. As soon as you mention Israel, their brains get scrambled.
Let me jump in here. You and I have talked about this issue on campuses. Of course, it's sort of close to my heart as an alum of Stanford Law School, and sort of some of the controversies happening there around due process and freedom of speech. I think a lot of us see the problem, but I know you've thought a lot about solutions or sort of steps. Can you kind of take us through a little bit? What would you sort of do?
Well, it's very hard. It's very hard to figure out what to do. I taught at Stanford for a year, and when I was there, I represented Bruce Franklin, who was a Maoist professor who was being fired. And most of the people on the Stanford faculty, including some of their greatest professors, Gerald Gunther and others, were very opposed to me. I was too liberal, too civil libertarian. And eventually Stanford fired him, a leftist. He had stood in front of the Computation Center one night and said, this was during the Vietnam War, wouldn't it, I can recite word for word, wouldn't it be a good idea if somebody took over the Computation Center? And then they took over the Computation Center. And so Joel Klein, ultimately became the Chancellor of Education, was my research assistant at the time. And he and I defended him on the ground that it wasn't advocacy. It was advocacy, it wasn't incitement. Wouldn't it be a good idea? Well, today at Stanford, of course, the National Lawyers Guild, let's understand where the blame lies. The National Lawyers Guild, which has branches in 100 law schools in the country, organized these disruptive events to prevent them from speaking. Now, a professor at Wayne State University said it isn't enough to silence and shout down conservative speakers, we should kill them. He got suspended. But what's the answer? So I'm going to throw a question out to you, you're a Stanford grad. What would you think of a proposal? I don't like the idea of judges saying, I will never hire somebody from Stanford. That's collective responsibility, that's wrong. But what if the leaders, the self-admitted leaders, the people who led the campaign overtly to try to prevent the judge from speaking, who would admit that to their friends, who would not deny it, what if their names were published and made available to judges and made available to law firms? It smacks of McCarthyism in some ways. On the other hand, McCarthyism was very different. In McCarthyism, they were revealing the names of people who had been communists 20 years earlier in the 1930s who didn't want to have their names revealed. Here we have students who are proud of having engaged in censorship. Should they be able to hide behind their anonymity when they seek employment? I can tell you, if I were hiring a research assistant, I would at least want to know whether they participated in this and in what capacity. If they just participated to protest, fine, you're hired. If they participated in order to prevent the speaker from going forward, I would say maybe you ought to go to work for Larry Tribe.
On the basis of all this, or as a result of all this, what is your sense of just the future of these institutions and the value? I mean, you've spent half a century, in this position. But if you rewound the clock, but the environment at Harvard was how it is today, not how it was then, and you were offered a position, would you say, I don't want to be a part of this, I'm going to pursue a career in private practice?
Well, it was much worse when I went to Harvard. When I went to Harvard in 1964, I was called the first Jewish Jew in Harvard's history. There were probably 2 or 3% of the faculty who was Jewish, but the best example was the most prominent Jew in the faculty was Harry Wolfson, who was the most distinguished professor of Hebrew and Jewish studies. He lectured his students, and he said, being Jewish is like being born with a hunchback. He said, there's no way to get rid of it, you shouldn't try to defend it, and you shouldn't be proud of it. And when I got to Harvard, it was just before the '67 war, I tried to organize a lunch group of Harvard professors who were Zionists and might stand up for Israel. I could not get a single professor at the Harvard Law School to join a Jewish lunch. I could not get Paul Freund, I could not get Louis Loss, I could not get Katz. These are all Jews who wore crimson underwear. And they wanted to be more Brahmin than the Brahmins, and they did not want to be publicly associated with any Jewish causes. Paul Bator said to me before my vote on tenure in '67, Alan, I love your work and I think you'd be a great professor, but you're hurting your chances. You're hurting your chances by wearing your Jewishness on your sleeve. My first week at Harvard, I'm 25 years old, I get a call from the chief judge of the First Circuit named Bailey Aldridge, who had been a descendant of the Rockefellers on one side and some Plymouth people on the other side. The most prominent guy imaginable. Here's the call. Professor Dershowitz, we have a club. It's called the Club of the Odd Volumes. You know how these things stick in your mind. 60 years ago. The Club of the Odd Volumes. Justice Harlan is a member of it. President Roosevelt was a member of it. And every year we invite the new dons, I had never heard the word before, the new dons, meaning the assistant professors, to come and tell us about their work. Would you like to come 2 weeks from now, Monday afternoon for lunch, and tell us about your work? And I said, of course, Judge Aldridge, I'd be privileged to do it. About a week later, I was at a meeting with the Anti-Defamation League, And I said to the director at the league, I've been invited to the Club of Odd Volumes. And he said, well, you know that club doesn't allow Jews. So I called Bailey Aldridge and I said, Judge Aldridge, I'm sorry, I can't come to the club. It wouldn't allow a Jew to be a member. He said, well, we're not asking you to be a member. We're asking you to speak. And I said, no. Within 15 minutes of that call, Dean Erwin Griswold, who was the dean of the Harvard Law School, came to my office and said, Alan, you've hurt your chances of being a tenured professor. Aldridge is on the selection committee, the Board of Overseers, as are 4 or 5 other members of the club. Please call him and apologize immediately and tell him you're going to come. I said, no, I'm not going to do it. And I didn't do it. I got tenure. But Harvard was a hostile environment when I first got there. Hostile in a different way. It was hostile to liberalism. When I was invited to become a member of the National Board of the American Civil Liberties Union, I got a lot of negative looks from Harvard faculty who were very, very conservative. So I like hostile environments. In some part of me, regrets having retired at 75. If I were at Harvard now, Carolyn thinks I wouldn't be able to stay there, that the students would disrupt and all of that. I would welcome that. I would use that as an occasion, as a teaching moment. But I can't give them a teaching moment if I'm not even invited, and I haven't been invited.
Just to vouch for that, I remember I was an undergraduate at Harvard, of course won't remember this, and you gave a talk about the case for Israel in the large hall in Emerson Hall.
Right.
I was sitting in the back, and it was pretty rowdy, and you really stood your ground, though. I can remember that.
Well, I gave a talk on Jefferson at Yale, and all the questions were about Israel. There weren't questions. They were hostile remarks, but I have to admit I enjoy that kind of confrontation. But a young kid coming from Ramaz and going to Harvard today is going to have a tough time. There's no discrimination against Jews at Harvard, but if you're a Jewish Zionist and you wear a kippah, life can be made unpleasant. By the way, let me give you the good news. There's never been more pro-Israel activism on college campuses than there is today.
That's what I was going to say. I mean, there's a story of real thriving.
There's both sides. I know kids today who are not religious, not Orthodox, and they wear kippah just to show identity. I wore a kippah when I spoke at the French Assembly. I went to speak at the French Assembly at a time when there was massive anti-Semitism, and I purposely wore my kippah. And I got criticized by the chief rabbi of France, who came over to me and said, it's easy for you to wear a kippah. You're taking the plane out tomorrow. Don't try to persuade my congregants to wear a kippah because they're going to get the crap beat out of them if they do. And he was right.
It's interesting, that actually became a debate between, I think, the chief rabbi of Strasbourg and the chief rabbi of France or Paris, over whether it was better.
Well, my favorite debate, of course, was between the chief Sephardic rabbi of Paris and Cardinal Lustiger of Paris. So the chief rabbi accused Cardinal Lustiger of being anti-Semitic. Cardinal Lustiger was born Jewish in Germany and converted and became a Catholic. And Lustiger said, I'm prepared to debate that with you on only one condition, that the debate occurs in Yiddish. Because Lustiger spoke Yiddish fluently and the Sephardic rabbi didn't understand a word.
Well, Professor, we called tonight uncancelled, not because we can make any guarantees about the book sales.
I don't care about those.
But because we believe that that's how it should be. The Sun is a paper that campaigns against the concept of cancellation. We can certainly vociferously disagree, but we believe that dialogue is always something that there should be a platform and opportunity for, and especially someone such as yourself who clearly has a great deal to contribute to the national conversation. So we're very grateful that you took the time to join us tonight, and we look forward to doing a whole lot more together through our pages and in conversations like this.
Well, I
So
would
thank
enjoy
you.
that, and I want to thank you for inviting me and breaking the taboo to some degree.
Right.
And I urge everybody to support the efforts of the Sun to undo the cancel culture and other un-American manifestations. Thank you. Thank you. Thank you, everybody.
Thank you for coming. Have a great evening.